welcome to episode 32 of the Absolute History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic cake history and the global medieval past. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. We are also sponsored by Turath Publishing. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit Turath Publishing at turath.co.uk and use discount code POD15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact Turath Publishing for details. I'm your host, Hassan, a PhD student at School of Oriental African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Abū Bakr Muḥammad ibn Zakariyyāঃ al-Rāzī, who lived between 865 to 925 Common Era, also known by his Latinized names Rhazes, was one of the greatest figures in the history of medicine in the Islamic tradition, and one of its most controversial philosophers. While we have ample survived evidence for his medical thought, his philosophical ideas mostly have to be pieced together on the basis of reports found in other authors, who are often hostile to him. To discuss with us the life, work and legacy of al-Rāzī is Professor Peter Adamson. Professor Adamson is Professor of Philosophy in Late Antiquity in the Islamic world at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, as well as Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy at King's College, London. Aside from articles, monographs and edited books, he is known for hosting the weekly podcast History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Welcome.
Hi Taha, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here because I'm a regular listener to your podcast, so it's great to be here, actually appearing on it.
Al-Rāzī was born in the city of Rayy, near modern-day Tehran, before moving to Baghdad to practice medicine. What do we know about his life?
That's right, he was born in Rayy, which is actually why he's called Razi. It's actually confusing, potentially. Maybe we should say right up front that we're talking here about Abū Bakr al-Rāzī, the doctor and philosopher who lived from the 9th to 10th century of the Common Era. So he died in 925 of the Common Era, which is 313 in the Hijri calendar. We're not talking about other famous people named Razi. In particular, we're not talking about the 12th century theologian and philosopher Fakhruddin al-Razi. It's especially confusing because Fakhruddin is a major source for information about our Razi, Abū Bakr. But hopefully we can avoid confusion during this conversation. So as you said, he is from Persia, and he moved to Baghdad, where he is credited with having founded a hospital there. Or in other sources, it's said that the hospital was already there and he became the chief doctor there. There's a nice story, actually, about him leaving meat in different areas of Baghdad and then building the hospital in the area of Baghdad where the meat spoiled most slowly. And that's actually a good example of the kind of information we have about him. So we don't have like a complete biography of Razi. We actually do have bibliographies of all of the works that he wrote. We have basically anecdotes about him. There's another famous one about how he would treat patients, where it's explained that his novice apprentices would first talk to the patient, and if the patient couldn't be helped by these beginners, they'd be seen by Razi's more advanced assistants, and if they couldn't help the patient, only then would Razi actually consult with the patient because they had to sort of bring in the big guns, right? So actually, as you can see from those two examples, mostly stories about him revolve around him as a doctor, and actually liked the way that you introduced him at the top of the show, because I think it's important to remember that he was primarily a doctor. And his philosophy, as you said, is mostly lost to us. We'll maybe get on in a bit to what we actually have from him in terms of what he wrote. But we have a vast amount of his medical literature. And a kind of reaction that he gets in the tradition from other people, other philosophers and doctors, like, for example, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Maimonides, is that he should have stuck to medicine because he was mostly a competent doctor. Maybe not perfect, but he was a very competent doctor and an incompetent philosopher. So in philosophy, he said all of these kind of provocative, daring things that got people very upset. And I actually think that although his philosophy is much more interesting than that, and deserves our respect and our analysis, it's very helpful to think about him from the point of view of him being a doctor, because I think that his philosophy was deeply shaped by his engagement not just with Greek philosophy, but also with Greek medicine, especially the works of Galen. And so if you think about him as someone who's basically a high-ranking doctor in both Rayy and Baghdad, who's also meeting with and interacting with and often getting into arguments with other people, especially theologians, like Mu'tazilite theologians and philosophers, that's who we're talking about here. And he seems to have been someone who was very happy to get in fights with people. Like he would sort of go around deliberately provoking controversy.
The metaphysical doctrine of al-Rāzī derives from the theory of the five eternals, according to which the world is produced out of an interaction between God and four other eternal principles. Tell us more about this.
Right. So I said just now that he is known for having put forward provocative philosophical theses, and these are pretty much always within one of two areas. So one area, which we'll get onto it in a second, I think, is his critique of prophecy. And the other area, which may or may not be related to that, is his theory of the so-called five eternal principles. So these five eternal principles are God, the soul, matter, time, and place. And one of the reasons why he was seen as such a troublesome, problematic philosopher is that he recognizes that these are all eternal principles, right? Hence the name Five Eternals. And this seems to be in violation of Tawheed, right? The oneness of God's eternity, of God as a divine principle, who's the sole eternal principle. And so what he does is he argues for the eternity and fundamental priority of these other four principles: soul, matter, time, place. And he has various arguments for each of them. We don't have time to go through all of these, of course, but just to give a kind of sense of why he needs these other principles. The easiest ones to understand are probably matter, time, and place. So his thought here is that if you accept the creation of the universe, which he does, by the way, then you have to also presuppose that God has something out of which he made the universe. And this will be eternal matter, which for him is atomic. So he thinks of matter as being made of these indivisible, maybe particles, sort of like the atoms of ancient Greek atomism. In fact, more like the atoms of ancient Greek atomism than like contemporary Kalam atomism. So God's going to make the universe out of these atoms by putting them in order. And he has to put the universe into a place, right? There has to be somewhere for the universe to be when God creates it. So that means that place is also going to be eternal. And there has to be a time at which God creates the universe. So that means that time is also eternal. So if you think about the situation he's imagining, it's like God decides to create a universe and he's already confronted with a situation where there's atoms kind of roaming around freely in apparently an infinite, unbounded space or place. And then God coalesces these atoms into a well-organized cosmos and puts it in one particular part of that unbounded place or space. And he does that at a given moment, but time has been going on the whole time, as it were. So time has been going on for eternity, and then at some moment, God creates the universe. So that's why we need to have eternal matter, time, and place. We need to have eternal soul to explain why God does this. Because, and I think this is actually one of the most interesting things about Razi's philosophy, he's a very pessimistic thinker in terms of his assessment of the physical universe and our place in it. So he thinks that the universe is full of suffering and pain. This may, again, have something to do with his having been a doctor, where he's very impressed by the amount of disease, illness, pain, suffering in the universe. And he seems to be pretty convinced that it would have been better for the universe not to exist. So if there had just been God and these other principles, that would have been the ideal situation with no universe, with no cosmos. And so his explanation for why the cosmos came to exist is that the soul, which is a principle independent from God, conceived, as he says, of a desire to be together with matter. And God allows the soul to involve itself with matter, even though God knows that this will be a bad idea and that souls should not do this, and then steps in to organize the universe so that it's not a complete catastrophe. So whatever's good in the universe is because of God's wisdom as a designing creator. Whatever's bad in the universe is blamed on the soul for taking this bad decision to get involved with matter in the first place. One problem he considers here, by the way, is if God is so powerful, why does he allow the soul to do this? And he says basically that God allows it as a learning experience for soul. So he gives an analogy that a wise father who has a kind of unruly son might allow the son to go into a garden which looks beautiful from the outside but is full of stinging thorns and insects. And the reason why God allows the soul to do this is because it learns from the experience that it shouldn't be together with matter, it should be together with God in the immaterial world. And that's what we're supposed to be doing now as individual souls. We're supposed to be step by step weaning ourselves away from the material world, concerns of the body, and turning towards the intelligible world where we can be together with God. And if we engage in philosophy, we'll manage to achieve that after death.
He has been accused of heresy by other Muslims for denying prophecy, or perhaps he was misunderstood.
Right. So this is the other major area of his philosophy where we're, just as with the five eternals theory, we're unfortunately in the position of having to rely on other sources. So maybe I should say something quickly about what we're reading when we read Razi, because I think it helps explain what's going on with the prophecy issue. So as I said, we have lots of his medical writings. We have almost none of his philosophical writings, even though we know from later authors like al-Biruni and Ibn Abi Usaybiyah, we have lists of the books that he wrote. So we know that he wrote treatises on the five eternals theory, and we have reports and sort of fragments, quotations from these. So when we're interpreting Razi's philosophy, we're sort of putting together stray bits of evidence the way that you would have to if you work on like the pre-Socratics or the Stoics or early Stoics, something like that. Then we also have a couple of ethical treatises by him. One is called On the Philosophical Way of Life, and there he's defending himself against critics of him who said that he doesn't live up to the standard of his supposed hero Socrates because he doesn't live an ascetic life. And that, by the way, also gives us some more biographical information about him. So, for example, he says about himself that his eyesight has gotten really bad as he's gotten older from staying up, copying out books every night. Okay, so we have that. Then we have another book called On Spiritual Medicine, which is basically a work of ethical advice. Okay, so there is actually, you could think of that as a kind of third area of his thought where we do have works by him, works on ethics. Now then, in addition to reports about the five eternals theory and these two works on ethics, we have this other dimension of his thought, which we know best through his debate with a contemporary named Abu Hatim al-Rāzī. So again, someone from Rayy, someone else named al-Rāzī. It's very annoying. Okay, so Abu Hatim is an Ismaili thinker. So in other words, he belongs to the Shiite group known as the Ismailis. And Abu Hatim says that he had personal encounters with our Razi, at a majlis, which means like a people where people are sitting around having debates and learned conversations. And he records what was said at this debate, or actually apparently at more than one occasion, where they had arguments about the five eternal theory and about prophecy. And then he goes on to quote from and attack a work in which he says Razi denied the validity of prophecy. And this is the most important basis for our knowledge of this dimension of Razi's thought. The work is lost, so we're basically going on what Abu Hatim says about it. And then we have some later authors who also talk about Razi's views on prophecy. In particular, another Ismaili author who wrote in Persian named Nasiri Khosrau talks about our Razi. So let me first tell you what they say about his views on prophecy, and then I'll tell you what I think about their representation of him. So what they say is that Razi rejected the validity of prophecy entirely, And of course, this would apply to the prophecy of Muhammad, but also all the other prophets who are recognized in Islam. And his argument was basically that God would not set up the world in such a way that only certain favored individuals are allowed access to the truth. Rather, God gives reason to everybody, and everyone's in a position to figure out the truth. And in fact, it wouldn't be just unfair for God to select certain people for prophetic wisdom. It would be actively counterproductive, because the different prophets would have different followers, and they would get into wars with each other, which would be bad. And he then apparently went on, supposedly at least, in this work, to complain about a whole bunch of individual topics that come up in prophetic revelation. So, for example, he rejects things in Revelation that compare God to a human or to something that would have a body. He complains about other various religious beliefs. And Abu Hatim is so outraged by this that he mostly refers to him as the heretic rather than calling him by name. So there's in no way a kind of neutral, dispassionate presentation of Razi. Now, this is actually something that has excited a lot of interpreters. So a lot of interpreters have really enjoyed this kind of, incredibly unorthodox version of Razi. So they've called him a free thinker. And I think actually, although I don't take this evidence that I just described at face value, I think reasonable people can disagree about this. So I think you could reasonably come to the view that Razi was criticizing prophecy. And then you have to kind of wonder how he would have gotten away with it, right? But that's more of a historical issue, not an interpretive issue. However, there are some good reasons to be suspicious about this evidence. In particular, one of these other later sources who reports on al-Rāzī, namely Fakhruddin al-Rāzī, talks about a whole bunch of different aspects of Razi's thought, including the five eternals theory. And in one case, he quotes al-Rāzī as having cited the Quran to show that the Quran agrees with his philosophy entirely. And there's no sense from Fakhruddin that Razi was attacking the validity of the Muhammadan revelation. So there's already a problem in the sources, how could these two things both have come from the same guy, right? And there's been various attempts to deal with this problem. In my book, which just came out about Razi, what I argue, and again, I'm not saying that this is definitely right, but this is what I personally think is the most likely interpretation. I think that what's going on is that Razi had angered certain very specific people, especially the Ismailis, which is why we have these Ismaili opponents who are telling us about his theory of prophecy. And I think what was actually happening is that he wasn't attacking the idea of prophecy, he was attacking the idea of the imamate, which obviously is crucial to Ismaili Shiite thought. So what he was saying is that prophetic revelation is valid. The reason it's valid is that it teaches the same thing as philosophy teaches, right? Which is why he says, well, the Quran agrees with me. So then his position on prophecy would probably have been a lot like, say, al-Farabi's, who's a rough contemporary. So prophecy is just a way of communicating to a wider audience what philosophers can figure out on their own, which is pretty daring, but not unheard of, right? And it's not the same thing as completely denying prophecy in general. But what he was completely denying was the idea that within Islam, there would be certain selected people who are religiously favored as leaders who have to be followed uncritically. So he says that following these people would be a case of taqlid, uncritical acceptance of authority, and that we should not do this, right? And then I think he went on to criticize some other specific things like, for example, anthropomorphic descriptions of God, which he considered to be religiously problematic. And then Abu Hatim came along, I think, and tried to re-describe this attack on Ismaili doctrine, or Imamism in general, as an attack on prophetic revelation. So I doubt that that's what he was really doing. I think basically what we've got here is a kind of misrepresentation of Razi, which has come down to us as the standard view of his ideas about prophecy. But as I say, I think reasonable people could come to a different conclusion on this, because the interpretation is so conflicting and contradictory.
There's a statue of al-Rāzī donated by the Islamic Republic of Iran outside the United Nations office at Vienna. how can his philosophical heritage still be relevant to us today?
I think that a lot of people who admire Razi now, including in the Islamic world, are admiring him especially as a scientist and a doctor. And there's a lot to admire there. So there's this massive, massive medical treatise that he wrote where he writes down the fruits of his reading and other medical works and some of his experiences as a doctor. And he says some really extraordinary things there about his practice as a doctor. So, for example, he describes testing a drug on an animal. He describes testing a drug and using a control group where he compares a group of people who he didn't give the drug to a group that he did give the drug to. So historians of medicine are rightly very excited by Razi. And when people emphasize the great achievements of science in the so-called golden age of Islam, and they might say, and also beyond the golden age of Islam, then they can very rightly point back to Razi as a kind of hero of scientific inquiry. So I think that's totally legitimate. In philosophy, I think actually maybe the best place to start for a kind of wider audience, especially because, as you've seen from this conversation, a lot of the evidence about his five eternals theory and his theory of prophecy is very problematic. So a better place to start is probably with the two ethical treatises I mentioned before, the philosophical way of life, and especially the spiritual medicine. So the spiritual medicine, when you read that, it's a lot like reading, say, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius or something. So it's a very humane and actually, in a lot of ways, very useful body of ethical advice for how to control desire, how to wean yourself off of bad habits, how to convince yourself not to be afraid of death, how to deal with grief, how to shield yourself from sorrows due to, broken friendships or lost loved ones, and so on. And I think it's also both that work and the philosophical way of life. You really get a sense of who he is as an author. So it's really like he's speaking to you the way that Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus do in the Roman Stoic tradition. And I think it's really remarkable to have works like that we're talking here about 9th, 10th century Islam, right? So to have an author from that milieu talking to you in such a kind of intimate and really very plausible, convincing, and also helpful way, because it's, especially the spiritual medicine, it's really like a work of psychological therapy more than anything else. And it's he's not the only person who wrote works like that in the Islamic world, but it's one of the best examples, and I think one of the most pleasant to read. And it's also kind of funny, actually. So, for example, there's a really nice bit where he is having a meal with this glutton, and the glutton orders a plate of dates and gobbles them all down, right? And Razi says, "So, are you satisfied now?" And the glutton says, "Oh man, I just wish that I could be hungry again, and then I would order another plate of dates and gobble them all down again," right? And Razi says, you should really think about the fact that that's not a good way to live, and you're going to have stomach aches, and actually in the long run, you'll feel more pain out of this way of life than pleasure, which is good advice. But also it's just like a very kind of immediate example, and it's a funny scene. And there are other bits in Razi that are also funny. So, I think he's just one of the most kind of remarkable characters from the classical or formative era of Islamic philosophy. And I think that he has something to say to us on a personal level, especially within ethics, as well as having been this kind of hero of rationalism and of scientific inquiry. So I think he's really well worth our attention still.
And finally, before we end, tell us where listeners can turn next to learn more about today's topic, and what are other current projects that listeners can anticipate from you?
Well, since you're asking, I will be so immodest as to mention that I just published a book about Razi with Oxford University Press. So this is in their Great Medieval Thinkers series. Something else that people might want to look at, especially if they can read French, is there's a really good new edition and translation of one of Razi's most important works, which I actually didn't mention, but is called On Doubts About Galen, in which he's criticizing the great medical authority Galen for a whole bunch of philosophical and medical things that Galen said. And that also has a really good introduction. So if you can read French, I highly recommend that book. It's by Pauline Cochet. as far as reading works by Razi, I definitely recommend reading The Spiritual Medicine. There's an old translation by Arbery of that. And The Philosophical Way of Life has been translated several times. Maybe the most easily available one is in this collection of readings on classical Arabic philosophy that was done by John McGinnis and David Reisman for Hackett Publishing. So those are some good places to start. In terms of my own work, I'm doing several things. So as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I do this podcast on the history of philosophy, which has already covered the entire history of Islamic philosophy. So listeners who are not familiar with that could check that out. So there's like 70 episodes on philosophy in the Islamic world. At this point in this series, I'm up to doing philosophy in the Reformation. But there's episodes on, classical antiquity, late antiquity, the Islamic world, medieval philosophy, Byzantine philosophy, and Renaissance philosophy. And we've also been covering other non-Western philosophical traditions like African philosophy and also philosophy in the African diaspora and in classical Indian philosophy. In the future, I'm doing Chinese philosophy. So those are parts of the project that I've been doing with co-authors. So that's ongoing. In my own research, I'm hoping to write another book in the same series that has the Razi book about Yahya ibn Adi, the Christian philosopher who lived around the same time. I'm also supposed to write the very short introduction to Ibn Sina for Oxford University Press. So I'm hoping to get that done next year. And I'm doing some research projects here in Munich on animals in philosophy of the Islamic world and on the reception of Ibn Sina's philosophy in the 12th and 13th centuries. So I'm pretty busy.
Professor Adamson, thank you for being a guest on the Abbasid History Podcast.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.